Hi, I'm Mr. Fear, and today we're going to look at 3 disturbing stories from people on Airbnb. Leave your like on the video and subscribe to the channel. Story number 1, The Cabin of Reflection. The Airbnb seemed perfect, a rustic cabin, isolated in the Great Smoky Mountains in Tennessee, surrounded by a dense and misty forest. The description said it was a retreat for those seeking peace and quiet, far from the hustle and bustle of the city. Lara and Ben, a couple in crisis trying to rekindle their relationship, rented the place to spend a weekend together. The host, Mr. Geller, sent detailed instructions on how to get there and a peculiar warning. Do not look into the large mirror after midnight. When they arrived, everything seemed normal. The cabin was charming, with antique furniture and a large fireplace. The only detail that stood out was a huge mirror in the living room, with a gilded frame stained by time. Lara, intrigued, questioned the host's note, but Ben laughed, probably just some silly superstition. On the first night, everything was quiet. However, Lara woke up at 3 a.m. to a noise coming from the living room. It sounded like a raspy whisper, as if someone was speaking very softly. She woke Ben, who, still drowsy, grabbed his phone and went to check. The fireplace was still burning faintly, illuminating the giant mirror. The reflection seemed off. He blinked a few times, feeling a chill down his spine. "It's nothing, honey. Go back to sleep." The next night, the tension grew. During dinner, Lara swore she saw something move in the mirror, a slender shadow passing behind them. Ben tried to calm her down, but he felt a growing unease. He decided to cover the mirror with a sheet before they went to sleep. At 2:45 a.m., Lara heard a wet sound and the rustling of fabric. The sheet had fallen. The reflection in the gilded surface wasn't theirs. It was something distorted. A grotesque version, with greyish skin and sunken eyes, grinning too widely. The couple froze. The image began to move independently of them. Ben, paralysed, felt his vision darken as the creature in the mirror tilted its head to observe him more closely. Lara tried to scream, but her voice disappeared. The reflection reached out its hand, and then something impossible happened. Pale fingers emerged from the frame. The entity in the mirror, known in the region as the Lady of Blood, was the spirit of Eleanor Whitmore, a woman accused of witchcraft in the 18th century. It is said that she was tortured and burned alive on the land where the cabin now stands. Her spirit became trapped in the cursed mirror, doomed to pull new victims into her dimension of eternal suffering. Ben reacted, pulling Lara back, but it was too late. Cold fingers wrapped around his neck and dragged him into the mirror. An agonizing scream echoed through the cabin as the glass shattered into a rain of bloody shards. Lara fell backward, covered in Ben's blood, who was now on the other side with black, empty eyes. The cabin shook violently. Lara tried to run, but she felt an invisible hand tear through her skin, opening deep gashes across her body. She fell to the floor, choking on her own blood, while her reflection in the mirror smiled. The next morning, Mr. Geller received a notification from Airbnb. "Guests have checked out." He laughed, shaking his head. "They always leave before the last night." He walked to the cabin, opened the door, and looked into the mirror. Inside, Lara and Ben were reflected, trapped in a silent eternity, their eyes wide with pure terror, their mouths still open in screams that no one would ever hear. Story number 2, Room 306. It was supposed to be just an ordinary trip. Daniel, a young photographer in search of inspiration, had found a cheap Airbnb in an old hotel in Charleston, South Carolina. The offer seemed too good to be true. Incredibly low rates, well-curated photos, and mysteriously scarce reviews. But he couldn't resist the temptation to save money. After all, who could imagine that such a charming place would hide such dark secrets? The building, with its decaying Victorian architecture and narrow hallways, carried an air of history and mystery. The owner, an elderly woman named Mrs. Monroe, handed him the key without saying a word, but her expression was one of evident discomfort. Her eyes, deep and shadowy, seemed to carry the weight of centuries of secrets. As he climbed the creaking stairs, Daniel encountered a butler, a tall, pale man with sunken eyes, who introduced himself as Mr. Wallace. "If you need anything, just call," he said with a forced smile, before disappearing down the hallway. There was something strange about that man, something Daniel couldn't quite define. When he reached his room, 306, a heavy feeling settled over him, as if the air had grown denser. The room was antiquated, with dark wooden furniture and a stained mirror beside the bed. The smell of mold permeated everything, mixed with something metallic that he couldn't quite place. As he set down his bags and prepared to rest, something caught his attention. The closet door was slightly ajar. Feeling a chill run down his spine, he quickly pushed it shut. That night, as Daniel edited some photos on his laptop, he heard a faint noise coming from the bathroom, a persistent dripping sound. But when he checked the faucet, everything was dry. The sound, however, didn't stop. It was coming from the mirror. The light flickered, and for a split second Daniel swore he saw a shadow standing behind him in the reflection. A thin man with a disfigured face, dressed in blood-stained clothes. He turned around quickly. Nothing. Just oppressive silence. The discomfort grew. The room felt colder, and the clock on the wall showed 3:06 a.m., even though he was sure it hadn't yet passed 2 a.m. Grabbing his phone, he tried to look up information about the hotel and found an old article about disappearances and murders that had occurred there in the 1920s. A guest had been found dismembered in room 306. It was then that he stumbled upon something even more terrifying. Among the names listed in an article about mysterious deaths at the hotel was that of the butler, Wallace. The photo was exactly of the man he had encountered earlier, but Wallace had been dead for nearly a century. Daniel continued his research and uncovered the dark truth behind the hotel. Mrs. Monroe wasn't just the owner. She was the guardian of an ancient curse. In the 19th century, the hotel had been built on top of an old indigenous burial ground, and the land was cursed. To keep the business prosperous, Mrs. Monroe made a pact with a malevolent entity that dwelled there. In exchange for wealth and power, she agreed to deliver a soul every full moon. The entity, known as the Soul Devourer, demanded sacrifices to maintain its strength. Room 306 was the epicenter of the curse, a portal to the dark realm where the entity resided. The mirror in the room was the key to the portal, and those who looked into it after midnight were pulled inside, condemned to an eternity of torment. The butler, Wallace, had been one of the first victims, a guest who discovered the truth and tried to escape. His soul was imprisoned, and he was condemned to serve as the entity's messenger, guiding new guests to room 306. When Daniel tried to flee the room, the door wouldn't open. The walls seemed to close in around him, and the air turned icy. The mirror began to vibrate, emitting a high-pitched sound that echoed in his mind. He turned to face the reflection, but what he saw was no longer his own image. The man with hollow eyes and blood-stained clothes was now clearly visible, but his form was transforming. The figure's skin began to peel away, revealing a pulsating black mass beneath. His eyes were like abysses, and his mouth opened into a grotesque smile, filled with sharp, irregular teeth. This was the Soul Devourer, an ancient and ravenous entity. Daniel tried to scream, but his voice was swallowed by the void. He felt an invisible force pulling him toward the mirror. His hands gripped the frame, but the creature's pale, elongated fingers emerged from the glass, wrapping around his wrists with supernatural strength. Daniel's skin burned where the entity touched him, as if consumed by an invisible acid. The Soul Devourer was no ordinary spirit. Centuries ago, it had been summoned by a powerful shaman from a local indigenous tribe. At the time, white colonizers were invading the tribe's lands, massacring their people and destroying their villages. Desperate, the shaman performed a forbidden ritual, invoking an ancestral war spirit to protect his people. At first, the spirit fulfilled its purpose. It was a force of nature, a manifestation of fury and vengeance. Its form was terrifying, a tall, slender figure with elongated limbs and a faceless head, just a dark void where eyes should have been. Its skin was made of living shadows and its hands ended in sharp claws. It decimated the invaders, leaving only mutilated bodies in its wake. But the spirit didn't stop. Its hunger for destruction was insatiable. It began attacking everyone around it, including members of the tribe itself. The shaman, horrified by the monster he had created, tried to control it, but the spirit was too powerful. It killed the shaman and continued its rampage, leaving a trail of death and despair. The surviving members of the tribe, desperate, sought the help of a sorcerer from a neighboring tribe. He proposed a bold plan: to seal the spirit in an object that could contain it forever. Using a sacred mirror, crafted from volcanic stones and bathed in ritualistic blood, the sorcerer performed a complex ritual. The spirit was lured into the mirror, where it was trapped, unable to escape. But the sealing wasn't perfect. The spirit could still influence the outside world, especially during the full moon, when the veil between worlds was thinnest. It whispered to those who looked into the mirror, trying to lure them into its prison. And with every soul it consumed, its power grew. Daniel fought with all his strength, but the soul devourer was relentless. The creature's fingers pulled him into the mirror, and he felt his body disintegrate, as if being taken apart molecule by molecule. His vision distorted, and he was dragged into a world of darkness and torment. Inside the mirror, Daniel saw other souls, trapped in an endless cycle of suffering. They were the previous guests of room 306, their bodies distorted and their minds broken. The soul devourer used them as sources of energy, draining their pain and despair to grow stronger. The last thing Daniel saw was the entity's face, now fully revealed. Its mouth opened into a grotesque smile, and it whispered, "Welcome to eternity." The next morning, Mrs. Munro went up to check the room. The door was unlocked. Inside, the smell of blood hung in the air. The mirror was clean, without cracks. The bed was untouched. But Daniel was gone. His name never appeared in the hotel's records. It was as if he had never existed. At the reception, a new guest arrived and received the key to room 306. Mrs. Munro hesitated for a second before forcing a smile and handing it over. The cycle had to continue. The spirit remains trapped in the mirror, waiting for its next victim. Mrs. Munro, now over a century old, knows her time is running out. She feels the entity growing stronger, more impatient. And on her darkest nights, she hears the whisper of the soul devourer, promising that when she finally dies, it will find her, and her soul will be the last. Story number 3, The Island of Mirrors. The Harrington family was known for their luxurious lifestyle and extravagant vacations. This time, they decided to break away from the ordinary and rented an isolated mansion on a private island, advertised as a paradise retreat. The property, called Graves Manor, belonged to an eccentric millionaire named Alistair Graves, whose history was shrouded in mystery. The island seemed perfect: untouched beaches, a dense forest, and an imposing mansion overlooking the sea. But what they didn't know was that they had stepped into a nightmare with no way out. The Harrington family consisted of 5 members: Richard, the patriarch, a successful businessman; Evelyn, his wife, a socialite obsessed with appearances; and their 3 children, Lucas, 16, Emma, 12, and Sophie, just 8 years old. Upon arriving by boat on the island, they were greeted by a sinister butler with sunken eyes and pale skin, who introduced himself as Mr. Wallace. He led them to the mansion, carrying their luggage in silence. The mansion was as impressive as it was terrifying. Its dark stone walls were covered in ivy, and the stained glass windows filtered the sunlight into somber hues. Inside, antique furniture and crystal chandeliers created an opulent atmosphere, but something felt off. The air was heavy, and the mirrors scattered throughout the house reflected distorted images, as if observing the newcomers. On the first night, as the family dined in the dining room, Sophie, the youngest, began to cry. She insisted she had seen a girl in a white dress in the hallway, crying softly. Richard laughed it off, saying it was just her imagination, but Evelyn noticed that the butler, Wallace, seemed uneasy. He whispered something under his breath, almost inaudibly. She doesn't like intruders. Later that night, Lucas decided to explore the mansion. He found a locked door on the second floor, with strange symbols carved into the wood. As he approached, he heard whispers coming from inside. When he touched the doorknob, a cold voice whispered in his ear, "Do not enter." He ran back to his room but swore he saw a shadow following him in the mirror's reflection. The next day, Richard decided to investigate the island's history. He found an old journal in the mansion's library, belonging to Alistair Graves. The pages revealed horrors. Graves had built an orphanage on the island decades ago, but his intentions were evil. He used the children in dark rituals, sacrificing them to an ancient entity called Azermelon, the demon of reflections. Azermelon was an entity mentioned in ancient Jewish texts, a spirit that dwelled in reflections and fed on the souls of the living. It was said that he had been summoned by a renegade rabbi during a forbidden ritual, and since then he had wandered between worlds, trapped in mirrors and reflective surfaces. Graves discovered the texts and, in his quest for power and immortality, made a pact with Azermelon. In exchange for sacrifices, the demon granted Graves an extended existence, but at the cost of innocent souls. When authorities began to suspect, Graves set the orphanage on fire, killing all the children and disappearing without a trace. The souls of the children were trapped in the realm of mirrors, where they wandered as ghosts, caught in an endless cycle of suffering. On the second night, the family began to experience inexplicable phenomena. Emma woke up to the sound of children's laughter coming from the hallway. Peeking through the keyhole, she saw several children in white dresses, with pale faces and hollow eyes dancing in a circle. When she opened the door, the hallway was empty, but the mirror at the end reflected the children smiling and waving at her. Sophie, meanwhile, began talking to an imaginary friend named Lily, who only appeared in the mirrors. Lily said she wanted to play with Sophie but always asked her to step into the mirror. Evelyn, worried, tried to cover the mirrors, but the closet doors opened on their own, revealing distorted reflections. On the third night, Richard saw something that filled him with panic. As he walked down the hallway, he noticed a tall, cadaverous figure reflected in the mirror. It was Alistair Graves, his face decaying and his eyes like dark abysses. Graves whispered, "You are my special guests. The ritual is almost complete." Richard tried to flee, but the mansion's doors were locked. He ran to Evelyn's room, but she wasn't there. Instead, he found Sophie sitting in front of the mirror, talking to Lily. When he approached, he saw that Sophie's reflection didn't match her movements. The girl in the mirror smiled, but Sophie was crying. The next morning, the family had disappeared. Their luggage was untouched, but the rooms were empty. The only sign of life was Richard's journal, with a final entry. "They are in the mirrors. They are pulling us in. There is no escape." On Airbnb, a new review appeared, written by an anonymous user. "The view is amazing, but the host never lets us leave." Graves Manor continues to receive guests, always handpicked by Alistair Graves. The souls of the sacrificed children still wander the hallways, and Azermelon, the demon of reflections, awaits his next meal. The island is a place of nightmares, where the living are merely temporary guests, and the dead are eternal.